From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. Venezuelans across the country signed a letter on Thursday addressed to the people of the United States in a people-to-people call for peace. The letter will be given to the U.S. government, and it condemns attempts to intervene in the internal affairs of Venezuela. In the document, citizens defend their right to independence, sovereignty, and self-determination. Millions more are expected to sign throughout the country.
Acabo de firmar en apoyo.
I have just signed a letter to support the right of independence and sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. I have just signed it and told the imperialist forces, hands off Venezuela. Venezuela deserves respect. We're going to send this to the U.S. in the name of all Venezuelans, thinking about the future of our country and always aiming for peace in our country.
Now to Uruguay, where speaking exclusively to Telesur, the Bolivian foreign minister announced support for the resolution reached by the mechanism of Montevideo. He also criticized the interventionist resolution made by the EU-backed contact group on Thursday.
Here in Uruguay, two proposals were made in regards to the situation in Venezuela. One by the mechanism of Montevideo, made up by Mexico, Uruguay, and CARICOM nations, and which Bolivia has adhered to as well, calling for an open dialogue to resolve the situation in Venezuela. The other proposal, promoted by the European Union, can be supported by Bolivia. The reason is because we can't support a proposal for elections in Venezuela. That is something that only Venezuelans must decide. That is an internal affair, and Venezuelans are the ones who must resolve this political situation.
And the EU-backed contact group concluded that they want snap elections to be held and for humanitarian aid to be accepted by the government.
The group, through the co-chairs of the meeting, that is the two of us, will proceed with the necessary contacts with relevant Venezuelan actors as well as with regional and international partners, with the aim of, first, establish the necessary guarantees for a credible electoral process within the earliest time frame possible, and second, enable the urgent delivery of assistance in accordance with international humanitarian principles. To implement these goals, the International Contact Group will send a technical mission to the country. The group will reconvene at ministerial level by the beginning of March to take stock of progress. And in between, we will have a senior officials meeting in the next couple of weeks.
And during this international summit, demonstrators in Montevideo rallied in support of the Venezuelan government. Protesters also came out against the EU-backed International Contact Group. They called for non-intervention in the domestic affairs of Venezuela.
We believe this is an imperialist stance both from the United States and European countries aimed at seizing Venezuela's natural resources, while ignoring the fact that the Venezuelan people have supported Chavismo for more than 20 years now. We think that should be respected, and that Venezuelans should decide their own fate, not people from abroad who have their interests that do not align with the well-being of the Venezuelan people.
In Venezuela, thousands rallied in the state of Guarico to show their support for the government of President Nicolás Maduro. The president of the National Constituent Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, joined the supporters. Demonstrators say they support the Bolivarian revolution and they stand against interventionist attacks by the U.S.
Imperialism wants to bring in humanitarian aid, but they have blocked us from buying food and medicine for our people. They cannot be more cynical. We do not need charity from anyone. We demand to the world to respect Venezuelan people.
And in Colombia, a demonstration was held outside of the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá to reject U.S. intervention in Venezuela, aided by the government of Iván Duque. Protesters say they want no part in war, especially as the Colombian government allows the U.S. to use Colombian border areas for operations. They say Iván Duque should first attend to the serious humanitarian issues in the departments of La Guajira, Nariño, and Norte de Santander. The governments of the United States and Colombia are trying to provide what they call humanitarian aid to Venezuela. But many worry this is nothing but a trap for the Venezuelan government that will increase international pressure against the Maduro administration. Let's find out more.
The Las Tienditas International Bridge in the city of Cúcuta borders Venezuela. It has been chosen as the drop-off point for the so-called humanitarian aid that the US and Colombia want to deliver to Venezuela. Neither the International Committee of the Red Cross nor the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is involved with this initiative, and far less the legitimate president of Venezuela.
What must be made clear is that the aid being offered and what could be delivered cannot be used as a tool to pressure the Venezuelan government, and it can't be given to just specific groups within the population.
The Colombian government's refusal to hold an open dialogue with the Venezuelan government has further damaged an already fractured relationship between the two nations.
We have asked for increased police and military presence, but it's not that we are preparing for battle. It is simply done to keep citizens safe, as well as Venezuelan migrants.
Distorting international humanitarian law, member nations of the so-called Lima Group and their supporters have turned down any offer to hold talks with President Nicolás Maduro. It appears their goals are more political and less humanitarian.
This is a complex topic, and we must focus on the different scenarios. Is there an armed conflict underway in Venezuela? There isn't one. Therefore, we can't really appeal to the rules of international humanitarian law, because these rules are to be applied in times of armed conflicts.
Despite the barrage of fake news and misinformation, Colombians and Venezuelans continue moving through the border. And while there are political differences, they ask that the situation not escalate into armed conflict.
There are many innocent people living here. Politicians need to fix their own problems without a war. There must be a dialogue.
Where will the bombs land? They're gonna send troops without any compassion.
Many have called on the Lima Group to demand that the United States lift the economic blockade against Venezuela.
A protest is underway outside the U.S. consulate in Johannesburg, South Africa, demanding an end to the U.S. attempts to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected government. Our correspondent Matuba Matlaji has more.
We are in the economic hub of South Africa, Sandton, #1 Sandton Drive here in Johannesburg, where the U.S. consulate is based, and behind me is a picket or a protest against what is called the U.S. imperialist behavior towards Venezuela. So now, few organizations from South Africa, including labor unions, have gathered here outside the U.S. consulate to show their dissatisfaction with how the USA government has been conducting itself towards Venezuela, trying to remove President Nicolás Maduro. Now, many things have unfolded here, with the show support to the Venezuelan government from South Africa itself and South African organizations, which themselves have experience of struggle against colonialist and imperialist governments. Now, as we speak to you now in Johannesburg, about 2,000 kilometers in Cape Town, the same thing is happening at the U.S. consulate there, with more protests against the U.S. government and its attempt for what is called a coup d'etat in Venezuela. It's back to you.
That was Matuba Matlaji. We have more stories coming up. We'll be back.
An occasion to enjoy the cultural diversity that defines our South American essence. Come along to find out the story behind these personalities, traditions, and artistic expressions that unite us as a whole. Real Lives, Friday, only on Telesur. Enjoy our programming from Monday to Friday, where you'll find the best information on culture, innovation, conservation, human well-being. Keep up to date on the latest innovations in science and technology with Atomun. The habits and knowledge you need to live a healthy lifestyle are on Guide Your Body. Environmental consciousness is required to preserve our Earth. Undergo your transformation on Green Zone. all about equity, diversity, and respect for identities on by gender, cultural manifestations, the art in all its forms, and the stories of real lives. Every day we feature a wide variety of content, only on Telesur, the news source from Latin America and the Caribbean. Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your Green Zone. Wednesdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. On Wednesday, demonstrators in Miami, Florida held yet another rally to denounce U.S. intervention in Venezuela. They held signs denouncing the media coverage by the Spanish-language channel Univision, which has been accused of biased coverage in favor of the Venezuelan opposition.
The United States historically has gone from country to country to country, imposing its policies, imposing its rule. And people in Venezuela stand up to this, people in Nicaragua have stood up to this, and so it's very important to defend the people in Venezuela who want to do that.
To speak more on these mobilizations within the U.S. of the government's interference in Venezuela, we're joined now by Camilo Mejia, who is in Miami, Florida, and attended Wednesday's night, rally happening at night. Thank you for joining us, Camilo.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So first, can you tell us how do you relate what's happening right now in Venezuela, for example, to what happened in Nicaragua, since you were born there?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the same thing. I would go even farther and say that a lot of the U.S. regime change operations in the Middle East also look pretty much the same. The format is very much the same. They take real social issues, whether they have created them or it's been a combination of real issues that the United States has exacerbated. They use that to throw people into the streets to protest, and they have people ready to shoot them, create confusion and chaos, blame the government, use that to isolate it, and then start building a case for invasion, which is what we're seeing in Venezuela at a much later stage than what we're seeing in Nicaragua. But it's basically the same format of regime change operation. And it's not looking good for Venezuela right now. The war drums are beating on Venezuela, and we just won't have it. We know what happened in the Middle East when the United States wanted to go there for their oil and geopolitical strategic power, and it's destroyed. Every time the United States gets involved somewhere, the country's destroyed, and we don't want to see the same thing in Venezuela. We certainly don't want to see the same thing happen in Latin America.
So why is it important to show all this solidarity towards Venezuela in a case that might seem a bit far away from where you are?
You know, ever since I served in the Iraq War, I've learned that there's no such thing as far away. We're one world, one people, and what happens anywhere in the world impacts everyone. So we're connected to the Venezuelan people because they're human beings just like we are. They have every right to live, to be self-determined, to live with dignity, to be a sovereign nation. So this is not really a consideration. I think it's the right thing to do to oppose U.S. intervention in the affairs of other countries. People know what happened when they started basically making up stories about President Putin and Russia interfering in the 2016 presidential elections. And now look at what the United States is doing, openly, basically calling for regime change in Venezuela, trying to impose someone who was not even voted on to be a president, and openly talking about going in there and bringing American companies to exploit their oil. So, I mean, it's just too blatant and too arrogant, and it's just wrong, and it's the wrong way to go right now. The United States needs to learn a better way to do business with other countries, to relate to other countries, to do commerce with other countries, rather than just going in there and destroying countries to take control of their natural resources. It's just the wrong thing to do morally. Many of us are also war veterans and military veterans, and we know what happens when the United States gets involved. So it doesn't really matter whether it's Venezuela or Iran or Iraq or Syria. We just don't want the United States going into other nations and destroying them. I think it's also very important to understand that this is not only about Venezuela. If Venezuela falls, we all fall. We're going to see another Middle East happen. Even if Venezuela falls, the people of Venezuela are going to continue to fight. People in Latin America are rising up. They're not taking this, and they're going to go into Venezuela and they're going to defend Venezuela, because the defense for Venezuela is also the defense for Latin America. So it's bad no matter what angle you're looking at it from. And we know the story. We've seen it too many times. In particular, war veterans have seen it too many times and too close to let it happen again.
So Camilo, have you been able to analyze a bit of how media is using the coverage of Venezuela in Latin America? For example, we saw protests against Univision.
Definitely, yes. We were a part of that protest as well. It's basically the same story. Media in the United States, and I would say for the most part, Western media, corporate media, view the world in the same way that the United States views the world, through a very much through a neoliberal lens, and they only report what adds to their narrative, what aligns with their narrative. So in the case of Venezuela, yes, it is true that there is scarcity. It's true that there is crime, that there is violence, that people are going without basic goods and necessities. What they're not telling is the full picture. They're not talking about how sanctions are responsible for that. They're not talking about how they have basically worked with sectors of the economy, basically the wealthy, who are the ones in charge of manufacturing a lot of the goods, and who are in charge of importing some of the goods that are not produced in Venezuela that people need. And they smuggle them into Colombia, and they create inflation, and they create violence, just the same as in Nicaragua, just the same as in the Ukraine, just the same as in the Middle East, where they have done this type of regime change operations. But they keep that from the public. They just tell the public that people are hungry, that people are going without basic goods, and that it's all because of socialism and it's all because of President Maduro. What we want them to do is we want them to present a clearer picture, a broad picture of what's happening, and to be more honest about assigning responsibility. The independent investigator of human rights at the United Nations, Mr. Alfred Al-Sayed, or Al-Sayed, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, traveled to Venezuela, and he did an in-depth study of the situation, and he basically put the blame on U.S. sanctions, and he likened them to a town being the siege of a town in medieval time, which was something that opposing armies, opposing kingdoms would do to basically starve a people into submission. And that's basically what the United States is doing in Venezuela, but we're not getting that from mainstream news media. What we're getting is that they're corrupt, that they're repressive, and that they're starving the people in order to get rich. So we want them to be more honest. We think that the truth is key, and the lack of truth is also key in order to manufacture consent for an illegal and immoral war. And we want the media to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is to report the truth.
And one last question, Camilo. We know there's a march on March 16 taking place in Washington. Can you tell us more about that and this whole anti-war movement in the United States?
Definitely, I think, well, it's being called by several people, lots of people who are anti-war. The Gray Zone Project, I think it's involved, Mint News Press, people from Code Pink, people from Veterans for Peace. A lot of the same people who have been marching and protesting war are now putting out a call. A lot of the anti-war organizing that has taken place in the United States happened after the United States ended the war in Vietnam, and there was a solidarity movement that started to focus on U.S. imperialism, particularly in Latin America, very much so focused on what was happening in Nicaragua back in the 80s, something very similar to what is happening now in terms of the United States, basically laying down the foundations for insurrection and to basically sabotage the government. And a lot of the people who came out of the Vietnam resistance to the Vietnam War are now, and who became solidarity workers with Latin America, are now seeing history repeat itself with the United States going after Latin America again in a big way. And they're coming out and they're saying, no, we didn't stand for it before, we're not going to stand for it now. It's going to be on March 16th in Washington, D.C., and we want to encourage everyone to participate.
Thank you very much, Camilo, for your time and for your very important insights on this matter.
Thank you.
We're talking to Camilo Mejia, a political activist and writer. Now we move to Colombia. 5 people were killed over just 48 hours in the southern Cauca department. 2 of the victims were ex-combatants of the former Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, commonly known as FARC. They were both shot in the head by armed men riding on motorcycles. A local mayor has urged the government to take action against the growing violence in the Cauca region. That is also where most of the killings of social leaders are taking place. In Brazil, 10 people are dead following a fire at the training center of Rio de Janeiro's football club Flamengo. 3 others were hurt on Friday after the fire broke out at Ninho do Urubu. The state-of-the-art training center was expanded and opened only 2 months ago. It's not clear if any of the players were injured in the blaze. Supporters of former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva are protesting after a court gave him a sentence of 12 years and 11 months for alleged corruption. They gather outside the Workers' Party headquarters in Sao Paulo to show their support for Lula. They claim he is the victim of political persecution and that these second charges are aimed at stopping him from running for president based on his large popularity.
Any one of us could be in the same situation as Lula if legal precepts are not properly observed. It's really serious when rights change according to the direction of wind. Law is something very important because the way a person is judged today can determine the way someone will be judged tomorrow. I'm talking here not as Lula's friend, not as a PT member, but as a citizen who is worried with the fate of the country, who does not like to see an injustice even against our enemies, because everyone should have the right to a fair trial. And there are too many symptoms showing that things are not going well regarding our judiciary's impartiality.
In other news, the 2019 International Book Fair has kicked off in Cuba. The fair will highlight the 500th anniversary of the founding of the capital, Havana, and the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. President Miguel Díaz-Canel attended the opening ceremony, which was dedicated to the writer and professor Eduardo Eras León. This year, the guest of honor is Algerian Culture Minister Assedine Mihoubi. The fair will tour around the country until mid-April.
The rich are spreading an empty rhetoric today that only promotes war, destruction and hunger, which all further pushing our planet towards chaos. But beyond this, there is Cuba, where we raise the flag from freedom, of independence, of peace and of justice. The legacy of Fidel Castro is more present than ever in the heart of his people and those from around the world who haven't sunk into despair.
It is a magnificent coincidence that Algeria is a guest of honor this year's fair. Culture is the basis of strengthening relations. It's a bridge to connect cultural cooperation and a great opportunity for us to showcase the distinguished civilization and history of Algeria.
We're taking one last break, but stay with us.